Shabbat Shalom, friends. He was known as the most dangerous Jew in Los Angeles. The most dangerous Jew in Los Angeles in the 1930s and early 1940s was Leon Lawrence Lewis. He was born September 5th, 1888. He was an American attorney, the first national secretary of the Anti-Defamation League, the national director of B'nai B'rith, the founder and first executive director of the Los Angeles Jewish Community Relations Committee. I worked down the hall from the JCRC with the women's division at the Jewish Federation of LA in the late 90s. Who was Leon Lawrence Lewis? Well, he was the son of Edward and Rachel Lewis, immigrants who migrated to Wisconsin. He grew up in Milwaukee, attended the University of Wisconsin. I forgive him for that, arch rival, and George Washington University. He received a JD from the University of Chicago Law School in 1913. After graduating, he accepted a position as the first national secretary of the ADL and began to work on discrimination cases in the Midwest. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, Leon Lewis enlisted and served in the Army Infantry and Army Intelligence in Germany, France, and England during and after the war. He attained the rank of major in the United States Army. And here I want to acknowledge the reporting of Susan Wampler from the University of Southern California. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, a clandestine attack by Germany already had been underway against the United States for nearly a decade. The battleground was not some distant shore, but Los Angeles. And the soldiers were Nazis and fascists whose plans included sabotage and assassination of some of Hollywood's biggest names. The government widely ignored the growing danger, but Leon Lewis paid attention. He was among the first Americans to come to terms with the threat that would ultimately engulf the world in war. Steve Ross is a professor of history at USC, and he learned about the Shoah as a youth. He wondered why Jews didn't do more to stop the Nazis. And years later, he was conducting research for his book called Hollywood, Left and Right. Ross realized that Jewish inaction against the Nazis before World War II was a false narrative. Many Jews did try to do something, he said, quote, but they had a divided strategy. Some felt they should be in Hitler's face and be very aggressive with an international boycott at least, while other groups argued that would only force Hitler to double down and persecute Jews even more. Ross, whose parents are Holocaust survivors, told the story of Leon Lewis and his fellow patriots in a book called Hitler in LA, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America. The book came out a couple of years ago, and Cantor Andy just finished it. I'm next. Steve Ross calls his book a cautionary story of what happens when hate groups move from the margins into the mainstream of American society, and when an American government seems complacent, or as some have argued, complicit. By 1933, Lewis was tired of the unwillingness of U.S. law enforcement to investigate Nazi activities in Los Angeles. After Nazis held their first open meeting in the city in July of 1933, he set about addressing the dangers being ignored by the FBI and Los Angeles police. So he began with 4 World War I veterans and their wives. Leon Lewis recruited a civilian spy ring. Unlike the swashbuckling spies portrayed on the silver screen, these were men and women from humble backgrounds. But they were even more courageous because the risks they took were real as they infiltrated every Nazi and fascist group in the Southern California area. Over the next 12 years, Leon Lewis and his band of anonymous spies discovered plots for sabotage, destruction, mass murder, and execution by hanging of famous Hollywood figures and the sympathizers who identified with them, who were mostly Christian, but men like Louis B. Mayer, Al Jolson, Charlie Chaplin, and James Cagney. In the 1930s, however, isolationist sentiments were running very high due to the Great Depression's economic woes and the previous war to end all wars still seared into the national consciousness. So even after Leon Lewis's network began getting results, many still refused to heed the warnings. Ross said J. Edgar Hoover was so obsessed with tailing the Reds that he completely ignored the Nazis and fascists taking root. And Los Angeles police chief, who was called Jim Two Guns Davis, told Lewis, right to his face, that Hitler was doing the right thing. Meanwhile, the Justice Department claimed to be hamstrung unless ordered into action by Washington. Steve Ross sorted through hundreds of boxes of the reports by Leon Lewis and his compatriots, and many of the reports include the actual dialogues of the spies and Nazis involved, including the so-called American silver shirt fascists, modeled after Hitler's brown shirts. Not all the stories of heroism and courage found by Steve Ross ended happily. 3 of Leon Lewis's spies died under suspicious circumstances. And of course, the book's final section leads up to what finally forced the entire nation into action, the attack on Pearl Harbor. After that grim event, FBI agents rounded up nearly 100 Nazis, Italian fascists, and even Japanese American agents. Since the Bureau had conducted little in the way of investigation before those raids, Steve Ross, the historian, is convinced the information that triggered them came from Lewis's network, which had supplied the FBI, naval intelligence, and army intelligence with the names and information about suspected German, Italian, and Japanese spies and fifth columnists. Ross said the FBI claimed all of it as their own, but Leon Lewis didn't care about publicity. He just wanted the job done. In his extensive research, historian Ross realized that the questions asked by his childhood self, as well as by fellow historians deep into adulthood, about why American Jews didn't take more action, that was the wrong question. The real question, according to Ross, is why the American government didn't do more. Hitler in Los Angeles is the story of the brave men and women, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who did more. Historian Ross said, they were fighting with everything they had to protect American democracy and equality for all. And for this, their only reward was knowing that they helped defeat the Nazi scourge, right here on our own soil, right in my own backyard. And for decades, their story went untold. I had not heard of Leon Lewis until a couple of weeks ago on our long drive back from Montana. I wonder if he knew that he was called the most dangerous Jew in Los Angeles. He's been very much on my mind, as you can all imagine, for much too obvious reasons, given the time in which we live. But when we read the opening of the book of Exodus, I cannot help but think of other dangerous Jews in our past. Couldn't it easily have been said, and maybe was, that Moses himself was the most dangerous Jew who ever lived? When we meet him as an adult, one of the first things we watch him do is kill a man in the name of justice. His reputation spreads. He flees and tries to remain anonymous for many years, which he does. But ultimately, of course, his destiny had to be fulfilled. And considering the messages of freedom and freedom from bondage that he brought to Pharaoh and to Egypt in the name of God and with the hand of God behind him, considering what transpired in Egypt, I think we could safely say that Moses was perhaps the most dangerous Jew who ever lived. But he, of course, whether he knew it or not, was inspired by other dangerous people. We are not sure of their exact background. The Torah is wonderfully vague. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shifra and the other Puah. These midwives, we don't know if they were midwives to the Hebrews, which would maybe make their bravery even more remarkable, or if they were Egyptians, or if they were Hebrews themselves, we will never know. But Dr. Lieber describes their behavior, fearing God, that they did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, letting the boys live. Dr. Lieber describes this as the first recorded case of civil disobedience, challenging government in the name of a higher authority. He says it would find an echo in the thousands of righteous Gentiles and others who risked their own lives to protect Jews from the Nazis. The midwives began a pattern that is continued in the story of Moses, whose life is repeatedly threatened by men and saved by women. As our Midrash tells us, it is through righteous women that Israel was redeemed. Certainly through these women who were willing to face danger, whom God rewarded, as we are told. We have extraordinary verses about these midwives, these dangerous people who looked at the face of authority and said, this is not just. This is not right. This has been the pattern of Jewish activists, of dangerous Jews throughout the millennia. As we begin the book of Exodus today and think on the legacy of Leon Lewis and his band of male and female spies facing unimaginable danger in a time when the world stood on the precipice of complete chaos, let's take a little bit of that danger, take it into ourselves. Remember that each and every moment that we live as Jews, we are dangerous Jews too. Let us be inspired by the example of these great and heroic people. Shabbat Shalom.